Hello?
The Harrison family moved into an old Victorian house surrounded by sprawling oak trees and Spanish moss in the small town of St. Martinville, Louisiana. The house was majestic yet slightly dilapidated, with tall windows, creaky wooden floors, and a spiral staircase leading to the second floor. I was John Harrison, an architect determined to breathe new life into the historic house. My wife, Catherine, a writer, was looking for seclusion to work on her new novel. Our 9-year-old daughter, Emily, was immediately enchanted by the spacious garden and the antique details scattered throughout the house. Daisy, our loyal golden retriever, began exploring right away, her curiosity leading her to every nook and cranny, especially the attic, where Emily found something unusual. In her room, sitting atop a dresser, was a dollhouse. It looked like a miniature replica of our new home down to the smallest detail. The tiny figurines inside were eerily lifelike, their gazes seemingly following Emily's movements. That night, as I tucked her into bed, she seemed quiet, her eyes occasionally darting to the dollhouse. Later that night, Emily woke up to the faint creak of a floorboard. She told me the next morning that Daisy, who usually slept calmly by her bed, had growled, her fur bristling as though she sensed something wrong. In the darkness, Emily had noticed the dollhouse looked different. One of the tiny doors was slightly ajar, even though she remembered closing it before bed. The next day, Emily approached the dollhouse with unease. She noticed that the figurine resembling her was gone. In its place was another doll with a distorted face, lacking eyes and a mouth. She did not say a word about it to us, but I could see she was uneasy. I assumed it was just her imagination and did not press her further. Catherine began noticing odd things around the house. She told me the clock in the living room stopped every night precisely at midnight, no matter how many times we wound it. Candles we had never lit were found burned down the next morning, their wax pooling in strange patterns. The house began to feel alive, as though it was observing us, and the dollhouse seemed to be the center of it all. As evening fell, the atmosphere in the house grew heavier. Moonlight streamed through the attic windows, casting jagged, unnatural shadows on the walls. They seemed to shift subtly, as though responding to our movements or our gaze. I could not shake the feeling that the shadows were watching us. Emily grew more fixated on the dollhouse. She told me once in passing that it looked different every time she glanced at it. The miniature figurines seemed less like toys and more like tiny sentient beings. Their faces appeared unnervingly realistic, and the way their eyes reflected candlelight made me feel uneasy. Emily began studying the dollhouse every night, trying to catch any changes, and she swore to me that she did. A tiny cup moved slightly, or a chair turned just enough to be noticeable. She told me the dollhouse was changing, but I did not know how to make sense of it. One night, Emily woke up to a faint noise, so soft it could have been mistaken for the wind. Daisy growled low, her fur bristling as she stared intently at the corner of the room. When Emily glanced at the dollhouse, she noticed that one of its tiny doors was ajar, even though she was certain she had closed it before going to bed. Through that small open door came a strange sensation, one that felt ancient and heavy. It was not a sound, but a presence, something that seemed to whisper without words. The peaceful feeling of the house during the day was gone, replaced by a creeping sense that something was calling from deep within its old walls. Emily turned away, tightly closing her eyes, but the sense of being watched stayed with her. The next morning, Emily approached the dollhouse and saw something that sent a shiver through her. The figurine that had looked like her was gone. In its place stood another doll, one with a grotesque mask-like face devoid of eyes or a mouth. Her hands trembled, but she did not say anything. She feared her parents would dismiss it as nothing more than a child's imagination. Catherine was noticing odd things as well. She told me that the clock in the living room stopped every night at exactly midnight, no matter how often we fixed it. She also pointed out that candles left unlit were found burned to the wick by morning. The house no longer felt like an inanimate structure. It was alive in a way I could not explain, and the dollhouse seemed to be at its center, the heart of something dark and mysterious. Shadows on the walls stretched unnaturally, and the floorboards creaked in a way that sounded deliberate, like slow, careful steps. Catherine told me she felt a chill whenever she passed mirrors, and once she thought she saw something behind her. A figure she swore looked like one of the dolls from Emily's room. The figurines in the dollhouse were changing. They began portraying scenes that made my stomach twist with unease. One doll had its eyes blindfolded with something dark that looked like dried blood. Another had deep red marks across its chest like slashes from a tiny blade. A third stood by the dollhouse door, its eyes gouged out, and its arms crossed over its chest as if in mourning. Emily studied the dollhouse more closely in the evenings. She noticed that it changed in ways that could not be explained. Doors that had been shut were now open. Furniture was rearranged in odd, unsettling ways. The walls inside the dollhouse were now covered with tiny cracks forming patterns that looked like snarling faces. One evening I saw her staring at the dollhouse with a look of pure fear on her face. When I glanced inside, I saw the figurines arranged in a scene that made my blood run cold. One doll lay lifeless with scissors protruding from its tiny chest. The other figurines stood around it, their hollow eyes fixed on the scene. Black stains spread from the corners of the dollhouse, as though the shadows themselves were bleeding into it. Catherine decided she needed to uncover the truth about the dollhouse. She told me she planned to visit the antique shop where she had purchased it. When she returned that evening, her face was pale, and her hands were trembling as though she had seen something terrible. She explained that the shopkeeper, an elderly man with a sorrowful gaze, had turned pale at the mention of the dollhouse. His hands shook as he told her its history. He revealed that the dollhouse once belonged to the Morrison family, who had vanished under mysterious circumstances. Their only daughter, Lily, had been found dead with her face frozen in an expression of sheer terror. Catherine also sought out a local historian to help her learn more about the dollhouse. He unearthed old records that linked it to occult practices involving figurines as vessels for trapped souls. He explained that each figurine was handcrafted and that the faces were molded from real people. He told Catherine that some of the figurines were said to be victims of dark rituals performed on the border between worlds. The historian warned her about the dangers of owning such an object. He described how others who had owned similar items had begun to lose their grip on reality. They reported seeing shadows in places where there were none and hearing voices in the silence. He cautioned her that the figurines might be tied to something ancient and dangerous, a trap for souls meant to bind them forever. When Catherine came home that evening, she told me she had seen enough to make her uneasy. She went to check the dollhouse and found that the figurines had shifted again. One figurine now stood on the roof of the dollhouse. Its porcelain face was cracked and dark liquid oozed from the fissure like tears streaming down its cheeks. From deep within the dollhouse came a muffled creaking sound like slow, deliberate footsteps. The dollhouse felt increasingly alive, as though it was tightening its grip on our family. That night the house was filled with a sinister tension. The air itself seemed to thicken, becoming heavy and oppressive. The figurines no longer simply moved. Now they depicted a horrifying scene. One doll lay with its limbs twisted unnaturally. Another appeared to have been torn apart. The miniature walls of the dollhouse were stained with dark patches that looked like dried blood. Catherine told me she heard footsteps in the attic, slow and creaking as though something heavy was moving across the floor. She said she glanced into a mirror and froze. The reflection staring back at her was not her own, but a life-sized version of one of the dolls. Its face was empty with hollows where the eyes should have been, and its expression was frozen in a silent scream. Later that night, Emily vanished. When I went to check on her, her bed was empty. The figurine resembling her lay shattered in two with a deep crack running through its chest. Catherine and I searched the house in a panic, calling Emily's name over and over, but the only response was an ominous whisper. It came from everywhere at once, as though the house itself was alive. Suddenly the lights in the house went out, plunging us into darkness. The creaking floorboards grew louder and closer. From the dollhouse, a thick black mist began to rise, swirling with shifting shadows. Among them, one shadow, taller than the rest, stepped forward. It was more nightmare than human, with elongated limbs and hollow, glowing red eyes. Its skin was a mottled gray-black, marked with deep cracks from which oozed a dark, smoky substance. It moved slowly, and its every motion came with a dreadful scraping sound, as though the act of moving caused the world itself to suffer. I froze, unable to breathe. My heart pounded so loudly it seemed to echo through the walls. In the darkness, I saw a silhouette that looked like Emily, but it was not her. Its hollow eyes and twisted grin mocked her gentle face. A single word drifted from its mouth, a word that was chilling in its familiarity. Mama. As the towering figure moved closer, the figurines within the dollhouse crumbled to ash. The house groaned as though mourning its loss, and the oppressive weight of its presence pressed down on me with all the force of its ancient terror. Something ancient and indescribable had been unleashed. The air was thick with dread, and every shadow seemed to stretch toward me as if alive with intent. In a desperate bid to end the nightmare, Catherine grabbed the dollhouse and slammed it against the floor with all the strength she could muster. The wood splintered with a dry crack, and I expected to see shattered pieces scattered everywhere. Instead, the inside of the dollhouse revealed nothing. No figurines, no furniture, no shadows. The emptiness was not a relief, but a warning of something far worse to come. From the basement came a low, resonant moan that sent shivers through my entire body. Catherine ran toward the sound, and I followed, my heart pounding in my chest. We found Emily huddled in a corner, her face pale and her body trembling. She was terrified but unharmed. Her wide eyes stared blankly ahead, and her lips quivered as if trying to form words she could not say. Clutched in her small hands was a single figurine. It was unfinished and faceless, and it seemed to radiate an unnatural cold. Weeks passed as we tried to recover from what had happened in that house. We could not bear to stay there any longer. The memories of the dollhouse and its horrors haunted us even in daylight. The old house was put up for sale, and we left it behind, hoping to escape the shadows that had followed us for so long. But as I walked through the empty rooms one final time, I felt the familiar unease return. In Emily's room, the dollhouse inexplicably stood once more. It was perfectly restored, as if it had never been broken. Its tiny windows glimmered faintly in the dim light. The shadows inside seemed to shift and swirl as though alive. I felt their pull, as if they were beckoning someone else to step into the trap. As I turned to leave, I could feel the house watching me. The dollhouse sat waiting in the silence, its cursed grasp ready to ensnare its next victim.